Well, in the Rector's update, I said, ask any questions. And one of the questions that was asked was about actually how I came to faith. Rather than writing this, it would take a long time to write, I think, my testimony. Obviously, I can make it incredibly short as well. But I thought I wanted to give an opportunity to maybe tell my testimony. And some of you may have not heard this. You might find it helpful to maybe share it with others, as well as it's via a YouTube link. So please feel free to share if it seems helpful. So where do I begin? I wasn't born or raised in a Christian household as such. Well, not a practicing Christian household in the sense of never went to church. Church played no part in our households. There was never conversations about God or prayer or faith or anything like that. God's faith, church, as a young boy, was irrelevant. It played no part in my life at all. Though I find it fascinating, and I only found this out a few years ago, after Mum had passed away and Dad was just sorting through some bits and pieces, in their home. And he passed me a box of stuff. And in the box was a christening blanket. And I sort of said, so whose is this? And he said, well, that's yours. That's your christening blanket. And I said, I didn't know I was christened. And he says, well, you never asked. It's like, oh, that's interesting. I had no idea I'd been christened as a child. And you kind of go, and therefore I also really think it's fascinating, those prayers prayed over the child at the point of christening, the impact of those prayers and that dedication of that child to God in later years. And you kind of go, was part of my Christian journey started in some way at that point of my christening, when I'm sure my parents gave thanks for my life, because I was not an easy birth. I was 2 or 3 months premature, meningitis, within the first year of being born, etc., etc. So it's a bit of a miracle I was around. So I can well imagine actually my parents, wanting to give thanks for me, at a christening. Maybe that was part of that kind of start of that journey. Who knows? Anyway, so I no involvement in church, wasn't part of a church. I think when I was about 5 or 6 years old, in the area where I used to live, Anlaby in Hull, and my best mate John at the time, his dad was a vicar, and John used to sing in the choir. And often, as you do with friends, you want to do what they do and spend more time with them. So I remember joining the choir in that church. And going along quite faithfully, and I used to love setting things up, putting the numbers in the hymn board and all that kind of stuff, and just being around to set things up. But I must admit, as a 5 or 6 year old, I did find the services tedious. I think if I had to summarise my experience of the church then, it was dry, boring, and irrelevant. To a young boy. And I remember one particular service, looking out at the congregation, and I remember it was droning on and on. And I remember some old member of the congregation had fallen asleep. I remember one of the choir boys, might even have been John, had been sick in the choir stalls and the smell was not good. And it was just, I kind of just examined and I thought, what am I doing here? And I left, so I left being a choir boy and kind of left the church. Though it meant nothing to me in from a faith perspective. And of course, I suppose my other encounter with faith was, as a young child at school, where you always had school prayer. At the end of the day, you'd have a set prayer that would all say, I really can't remember what the words were. So you had this sort of latent idea that God was a somebody or a something that you made requests to, like a genie in a bottle. No different, really for me at the time. You kind of rub the genie, hopefully something good will happen, or you say a prayer and hopefully something good will happen. So I think that's probably my only process, or my only thoughts around faith and God. Other than that, played no part in my life at all. But I do remember as a young lad, I was often in trouble. That might not surprise some of you. And I would often get into trouble, and sadly I would often get into trouble with the police. I'm doing a range of things. Grand arson is one of them. Shoplifting is another. And a range of other things. So I'd often get into trouble with the police, and I'd been in trouble with the police a few times by this point. And I do remember I'd really made a mess at this particular stage, and I was maybe 10 or 11, I think. And the police were about to come round and interview or whatever else they were going to do. And I was somewhat worried because obviously my parents were none too plussed, and they'd keep sort of saying, well, they're going to, put you in prison and throw away the key, the fear of God, into me. And I do remember being quite fearful and worried about this and praying. And I remember this very, very long-winded prayer of sorry I said to God for having made such a mess of things time and time again. And I can't remember how many times I must have been sorry in so many different ways in this prayer, in the hope that somehow, I wouldn't be, thrown away and the key, locked up and the key thrown away. Now, I can't remember the outcome. I mean, clearly I wasn't thrown in prison and locked up, but I do remember at the end of that prayer, because I knew I'd get into trouble again, saying to God, rather than me do this very long prayer, could I just condense it? Because it felt like it took forever to say this long, sorry prayer. Could I just condense it to saying Amen? And what was really interesting, I then got into this habit as a young boy, before going to bed, saying Amen, as a way of kind of catching all the mistakes I maybe have made through that day. And then life kind of carried on, and I guess at some point I got out of that habit as I kind of became a teenager and then kind of a young adult, and left home when I was 17, 18, moved to Huddersfield, started to work for a large company in Huddersfield, moved into a house with a mate of mine from work, and faith, God wasn't a part of anything. Actually, other than one thing, which was fascinating. So as a young lad, I always had skin problems, spots and acne and that kind of thing, and not a lot of, self-esteem or confidence because of how I looked. Didn't particularly like myself, etc. And I do remember, this was before I moved into this house with my mate Justin. I do remember standing in front of the mirror in this little bungalow I was living in at the time, as part of the company, kind of provided it for a few months as I settled in. And I was standing in front of the mirror, and I must have made a casual throwaway prayer of, I wish you'd heal me of this. The acne, that is. And again, didn't give it a lot of thought. And I remember 2 days later, maybe, standing in front of the mirror again, doing up my tie, shirt and tie, looking in the mirror and noticing all of my acne had gone. Just like that. And you kind of go, and you didn't pay a lot of attention to it other than, oh, that's bizarre. I hadn't joined up the dots by that point. So I remember that, moving in with my mate Justin. All right, let me take a drink of tea. Moving in with my mate Justin into this 4-bedroom house. And as you can well imagine, 2 young men, house to themselves, we had a great time, as you can well imagine. And we got to a point, and we paid peanuts for this place. But we got to a point where we sort of said, we could probably do with getting some more people in, some tenants in, to come and, share the bills and all that kind of stuff. So we did, we advertised, and actually we got 2 girls, 2 girls ended up moving into the house with us. Both of them were at Huddersfield University, while Justin and I worked at Hoya, transport company. And then we struck up a friendship, with these girls, as you well imagine. We go out for drinks and clubs, etc. together. And I do remember Kath, one of the girls, she would disappear on a Sunday morning. whilst obviously Justin and I are still recovering from Saturday evening, should we say. And she'd go off and she'd come back home about lunchtime. And I remember asking her, where on earth do you go on a Sunday morning? That's just the furthest thing from my mind is doing anything on a Sunday morning. And she said, oh, I go to church. Do you want to come with me? Well, my answer was a clear and resounding no, thank you very much. I've got no interest in church whatsoever. And that's kind of how we left it. And then we had just these other bizarre coincidences that then just kind of took place. And I remember, I've always loved music, and 80s, 90s, kind of music. And I remember listening to a track by Hothouse Flowers. It's been good for me, it can be good for you. And that line just stuck in my head when I was listening to the album. It's been good for me, it can be good for you. It would not get out of my brain. And I kind of made that connection with God, faith, church. It's been good for me, Kath. It can be good for you, me. It wouldn't leave. And then at that time, I remember my healing of my acne, kind of at the same time. I remember I wasn't a particularly happy young man. I had all my background of, trouble with the police, etc., etc. Kind of often weighed heavy on my mind at the time. And then there was another thing that happened that was just bizarre. Always been a fan of U2, the artist or the band. And they had a new album coming out. And the night before the album came out, I had a dream. And in the dream was the line in the song about wild horses. And I remember visualising this and the line, something about wild horses. And then the next day, their album was released and they played a track on the radio that included the line in one of their songs, I can't remember the exact song now, about wild horses. I remember thinking, I dreamt that the night before. Now, it may have been coincidence. I may have heard it somewhere else, I guess. But in my head, there was a series of just odd coincidences that just were unexplainable. And Kath was still going on about trying to get me to church. Now, as time went on, I quite fancied Kath. And as you do what, if you're interested in somebody, you go along with them to the things they do. So she asked me again and about going to a morning service. I said, I'm not going. No, she goes, well, they do an evening service. Would you like to come to that instead? I was running out of excuses. So I finally conceded and said, fine, I'll come along with you. So I knew what time the service was. It was about 6 o'clock. I knew what time the buses ran because you had to get the bus down into Huddersfield from where we lived. And I thought, if I time this right, we'll be late, miss the bus, and therefore not get to the church service. So I kind of dragged my heels, procrastinated, deferred, etc., knowing we would miss the bus. Finally left the house, arrived at the bus stop. I was confident the bus would not arrive, and the bus arrived. But I checked the number, I knew which bus it was, and I knew the bus that arrived was not going the way it needed to go to get us into town. I knew it would go down a different road altogether because I knew the buses pretty well back then. Anyway, this bus arrived, stopped at our stop, which it shouldn't have done, which I was a bit surprised by. We jumped on it. I thought, well, no worries. I know it has to turn down that hill to go that way and not go straight on where we needed to go. Anyway, the bus went straight on where it wasn't supposed to. In the back of my head, I thought, God, you'll be in so much trouble. You've gone the wrong way. So the bus goes the wrong way. Lo and behold, gets us into town. And we then, because I've got no excuse, we then get to church with literally a minute or two to spare. I was like, oh, that's just bizarre. So we enter the church and it's an Elim Pentecostal church. Now, of course, my experience of church is, Church of England, cold, dry, boring, irrelevant. As a young lad, that was my thoughts. And we go in and we sit at the back, I've got my eye on the door so I can make a beeline for it if I need to. And we sit at the back and this pastor, Ian, speaks. And he speaks for the first time. Oh no, going back to my first point about my first observation. So my observation is we go into this place and you've got a band, guitar, keyboard, drums, vocalists, etc. And it's quite upbeat, very friendly, kind of made to feel very welcome, etc., etc. Completely, that's not church. That's not my understanding of church. This is a bit different. Then, back to and then Ian, the pastor, assistant pastor, speaks. First time he'd ever spoken. He's obviously fairly new to the church. First time he'd ever spoken. And he gives a sermon around something. But the core of his sermon was about, all of your past mistakes being forgiven. And about having a new opportunity and a new life and being born again. And being loved by God. I just soaked up everything he said. Because obviously what weighed heavy in my mind was about my past, all the stuff I'd done wrong. Actually, we'd had 3 bereavements in the family, in kind of quick succession, within our family, therefore death, kind of what weighed quite heavy upon my mind about, the finality of death and what happens when you die. And I've been a bad lad, so you kind of, you know the narrative how that one goes. Having a new opportunity to start again, about being loved and valued by God. I had quite low self-esteem. So all of these things, it's almost like Ian, when he was speaking, had a spotlight on me and somebody had told him all about me. It just felt exactly like that. And so I'm riveted by what Ian's saying. And we get to the end, of his address, and he gives, as is often the case in a Pentecostal church, he gives an invitation to respond. And he sort of says to those in the church, if this message has touched you in some way and you want to, give God a go, in my words, then raise your hand. And I thought, I've got nothing to lose here. But what is there to lose? In all of this, in giving God a go, I thought, why not? So I did. I think at the time, everybody closed their eyes and, heads bowed. And I remember raising my hand and thinking, well, give it a go. And Ian, prayed for those people who'd raised their hands, and then, everybody opened their eyes. He then sort of said, and those who raised their hand, would you come out to the front? Well, at that point, I looked at the door and thought, do I exit quickly or do I go to the front? I suppose in my head, a bit of a Hull saying, I suppose, in for a penny, in for a pound. And it's like, well, I've got this far, I might as well go to the front and see what happens. So I went to the front and this other chap came to the front, so just the 2 of us, I think the church was, enthusiastic and prayed for us, etc. And that was it. You'd like to sort of say there was, fireworks and the Holy Spirit coming upon me, transformed life, etc., etc. Nothing like that. But I'd made a commitment. I'd made a decision to give God a go. And so I guess from that point, I then started to attend church, Elim Pentecostal Church, with Kath at the time. And started to grow, I guess, in my Christian faith, to be part of the church, to read my Bible, to pray. Then went to Albania and did some mission work in Albania, inner city Cardiff, did some work in mission work in inner city Cardiff. And on the story then goes. But I'm mindful this is probably quite long. And therefore that's my story of how I came to faith. I guess there's always other stories in my testimony. How I came to be a vicar is a different story, but that's maybe for another time if anybody's interested. But anyway, that's my story of how I came to faith. Hopefully that's helpful, but if nothing else, it's just a great opportunity for me to remember my story of where I've come from, and obviously as I now consider my next chapter, Christina's next chapter, and of course your next chapter. Knowing that God moves in many wonderful and mysterious ways then and now. And actually my encouragement to you is maybe that whole give God a go. What have you got to lose? Bless you. Thank you for listening.